First off, I just hope everyone's having a wonderful Thanksgiving. And, it's important to be thankful for the things we have here in the West. So it's just insane to me to think that we have, like, this whole situation where you have protesters going out, you know, after Charlie Kirk was killed and then protesting that Turning Point was still holding rallies, even though it was one of their last ones. It was their last one. So we had violent protests over the weekend. And now going into Thanksgiving, I think we should all remember because you have other places around the world, in places like Nigeria where they're still fearing for their lives, and Uganda as well, where there's religious persecution. We have to be grateful, in countries that have freedoms, even Western countries that are losing them. So you see that in Europe and a lot of these westernized countries that have become weak through radicalization in politics. And it's also led to the mass immigration issue that we face now, where you have unvetted and undocumented immigrants flooding European countries. And it's happened in America too with the open border. The primarily like in Europe, they're coming from unstable regions like Gaza, where there's been wars constantly, like nonstop, lawlessness. So you have like a dynamic where it's different there. Whereas you had illegals, Hispanics, most Mexicans are actually against the cartels. That's what you saw with these recent protests in Mexico. Most people in these countries are against the cartels. It's just the very few that control them and that control the governments as well because they have all the power. They get off of the narco trade. But the drug trade and narco terror are almost equivalent to what you'd have with religious extremist terrorism. Narco terror, you have human trafficking, you have drug smuggling, and cartel activity in the states. Trump targeting the boats has been cutting that source of income off as well. And so we're looking at a potential military escalation with Venezuela and a conflict there that will likely involve just a week-long war or conflict that would see strikes on military. Also, the military have been involved in securing the border. But on another note, it's been noted recently, it's been pretty apparent on the internet that there's been a rise in anti-Semitism as of recently. And I just want to comment on this and say that it's just ridiculous that we would harbor such hate and like thoughts of hatred. And for one thing, it's the internet, so it's like whatever, everyone's always going to have reason to hate someone. But they just make up these grand conspiracies like Candace Owens talking about the most like ridiculous things that should be ridiculed if, she was anything but talking about the Jews. And, it's just at a certain point, it's so ridiculous to think that these people are experts on anything, let alone mocking other people or downplaying their own beliefs. So I just think that we should tolerate all different opinions and ideologies. But at a certain point, these people are haters and they're just professional mockers and scoffers, and they go out and they're just like, that's all they do. And if you're just talking about the Jews all day and they're just like, oh, the Jews, that's all they talk about. And it's like at a certain point, you care more about the Jews than America, but you're calling yourself America first. And people like Candace Owens, you know, she's just a quack, honestly. Like the things that she thinks, she doesn't even think the earth is round. So it is what it is, honestly. It's just ridiculous. You can't don't logically debate with someone like that or have an argument based on facts or reason. So, they inevitably revert to like hate and like blind anti-Semitism and just honestly the most violent, like vitriolic behavior, like humanly possible. If you think about like the worst of humanity, and these people embrace it openly, like, the gropers, I call them, these people are like actual scoundrels but they're degenerates. These people are anti-Semitic to the fullest extent, like Nazis and like avowed Nazis. And we shouldn't ever tolerate these people in society, in polite society. Like we don't have to cancel people like this. But when you're talking about Nazi fascist ideas, at a certain point, you're just breeding hate, and you're just kind of like replaying the same events in history that led to so much carnage and death and destruction to the extent that it formed our entire worldview now that's based on resisting those ideas. So to embrace this, just because the term Nazi's been watered down by the left over so many years, honestly, at this point, that people downplay it to like a massive degree. But anti-Semitism remains a constant problem. And, people just get tired of it at a certain point because it's used in every argument, to just justify any kind of like moral action or, moral posturing. And it's ridiculous, they did this about Trump for years. And, the entire public is pretty much over that kind of sentiment. But it always arises again because people have watered it down and no one really cares anymore about the deeper meaning behind anti-Semitic ideas in the past and the context of having those beliefs and like how a Jew would feel if you were having ideas that were openly like expressing the death or like destruction of the Jews, like from the river to the sea, an open expression and a calling to violence, in my view. Saying that expression from the river to the sea is a clear term that does not like that implies that Jews don't have any claim to the land and don't belong there and that none should remain. So you're talking about mass genocide. Either way, these people are the ones that the moral grandstanders, the moral justifiers, are always the ones that just revert to calling for genocide instantly as soon as it favors them. So as soon as it's about the Jews, they'll gladly call for genocide then. And, the term genocide was invented for the Jews and the killing of the Jews. So the fact they twist it around, they have to make up genocides when there's ongoing genocides in Africa and in different places and call everything a genocide. And then at a certain point, they're watering down that term as well. So it's just ridiculous. And then obviously these people, they always just revert to that same trope. And it's like, kill all the Jews, whatever, it doesn't matter. But they don't have a place in Israel. And the Jews obviously have a place in their homeland. And that's their birthright. And the fact that they've been returned there, as a people, culturally intact, in their beliefs, I think that they should be respected in the fact that it's different to be anti-Semitic in terms of the viewpoint historically that they've been oppressed by this in the past and like recent history relatively. You're talking about like mass genocides that they witnessed at the hands of politics and political sentiment. So you have to take in a historical context if you're going to form beliefs and opinions about things that happened in the past as well. If you're already going to like go there in terms of like Hitler and avowing Hitler, in terms of like Nick Fuentes, these people are a disgrace and they made a joke out of figures like Charlie Kirk that really believed in truth and dignity and honesty and integrity. And the fact that they really trashed his legacy by coming up with all these conspiracies to blame the Jews and things for his death, when it was very clearly far left violence and radicalism in American politics that led to this outcome. And if anything, I mean, these are the people who benefited the most from his death because he was a reasonable and common sense voice and really a moderate by many standards. And I would consider him very much a moderate. And he was basically the main force, I'd say, holding back these more deranged voices in the Republican Party, these more out of touch, out of sync, and really unreasonable people that don't form their opinions based on any kind of like, overarching logic or common sense approach. And they claim to be like America first. But all they talk about is Israel last and blame the Jews for everything. It's all a conspiracy. And, at a certain point, if the Jews have been in control of America or whatever, you're talking about at what point and what were they responsible for? There's like anytime that anything bad happens, you're going to twist it around to blame the Jews. And this is what these people do because they're just snakes. And it's always just like the same victim, always. And it's all these elaborate conspiracies just to come to the same conclusion. And it's the same way every time these people even discuss a topic. Israel's always on their mind. So it's really not America first. So these people masquerade a lot of these, the Candace Owens type, which are just really fakers. And they made a whole, really, they trashed the legacy of Charlie Kirk by going out and saying that you're seeing him in your dreams and that he said the Jews, some grand conspiracy, the Jews killed him. Yeah, give me a break, because it's really ridiculous at a certain point that anyone would listen to her. I mean, I bet, I haven't heard, but I bet she believes she's astral projecting to different dimensions and pseudoscience that you hear all over the internet already. And at a certain point, certain things, I just tune them out because I can't take it seriously. And that's not based on ideology. It's just the fact that, like, you can't prove any of these things. And you make 100 different allegations in one video. You blame 20 different people and come up with 20 different conspiracies. You can't back any of this up, and you don't have any evidence. And so people like Candace Owens, they don't rely on evidence. They rely on just getting out there and slandering any party that is really in opposition to them, and it's always the Jews. So it all comes back to the same group. and it's always the same thing. It never changes. So every damn time you see these people, it's a anti-Semitic group, and these people used to be the minority in political discussion, but they're obviously growing in popularity. You see Nick Fuentes now just slandering and flouting and toting anti-Semitic thoughts and philosophies based on communism and fascism and all the worst of politics around the world that we've had to experience as a society and as a species. The foundation, these people reject the very foundation, the fundamental core values of Western society, and that's the point. These are decivilizing forces. So these are people that are all working in tandem. These are people who work in tandem. So these are people that work really hand in glove with the anti-establishment groups, the anarchist groups that we see always so prevalent in America, where they're given the freedom of expression, obviously, but you have always an opposition to common sense philosophy and real leadership, as we see with Donald Trump. You always have this fringe group of minority political views, and they're always expressed the loudest, and that's always just an issue in American politics, I'd say. In terms of social media in general, it's really polarized and highlighted these more fringe voices to a major extent, and as well as the fact that controversies surrounding them and being platformed by, you saw Nick Fuentes be platformed by Tucker Carlson, which really he shares a lot of the same views, and just really, in my opinion, my view of that interview, just let Nick Fuentes go off on all his opinions so that he could deflect blame, and didn't really push back at all. And this is a constant problem with people like Tucker Carlson that pretend to be America first, but really they have an agenda, and it's not non-involvement, it's not non-foreign involvement or isolationism. They're not actually non-interventionists if you think about it, because they're all in for intervention against Israel. And that's really what it comes down to and what they want. And you can't even think, even from a practical sense, that America could just isolate itself from the affairs of the world completely and cut ties. Like, yeah, we have the biggest economy, we have the biggest markets here, but you have to take other things and factors into consideration as well. Cutting ties globally, you cut a lot of opportunities and reliances that we're dependent on, that we need for certain resources. And you can't just assume and pretend that if you close your eyes and, huddle up in the fetal position and get defensive, that nothing will ever come home, or, the chickens won't come home to roost eventually. Because that's really the case that we found in the past, like before World War II, for example, when there were these same political fringe voices being heard in America as well, and there was a more isolationist tendency. But sometimes it takes that attack to remind everyone, because people seem in America to have a lack of grasp on history, because they live in this Western society that doesn't have a whole lot of rich history of invasion, that they have a grandfather that was through exile or put into a camp or whatever, face an actual real world invasion. We just haven't had that kind of history here of violence. So a lot of people don't teach or learn this stuff, at least to the degree, like modern American history. They don't seem to understand or learn from the mistakes, but at least in a democracy, we learn from failure. So that's just how the system works here. But, I feel like a lot of these voices will get rooted out. I personally couldn't see one of these people winning an election, because the amount of hate that they spew, it's not even a threat to democracy to consider that they should, because, in a free public discourse, these voices will get rooted out because they're just destructive, decivilizing forces that have no place in a democracy or a free democratic discussion. And that doesn't mean to cancel these people. Like I said, this means to expose them in free discourse and disprove their ideas, which have been historically disproven time and time again. Every example, every leader that they talk about, Joseph Stalin, and these people, the West, our society defeated them, so they're really following the footsteps of failure there, and it's not going to pay out well for them, and we just shouldn't listen to voices like this, and that's just what it comes down to me. So now on to Venezuela, as many of you know by now, and I just want to say before anything else, I'm sorry for the shoddy lighting and the bad camera angle. This is a new podcast studio I'm working on for longer form videos like this. So still a work in progress, obviously. But on to Venezuela. Right now we see Maduro cowering, quite frankly, acting a little delusional as he trumps around, and he just really has been making a fool out of himself as of recently, out of fear, I can only assume. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but Russia's made moves there, China's made moves, and they've really worked with our allies a lot as a cartel funding state, a terrorist state you could consider, but certainly a dictatorship that should be overthrown. So the U.S. is considering regime change there. I believe that there's multiple carrier groups in the area, so we would have air superiority and the necessary firepower to take care of that situation in only a matter of days. I could not see that war taking a very long time, because we fight 7-day wars, but I couldn't see it going past a couple of weeks, just due to the lack of the resources of the Venezuelans and the fact that they just don't have the equipment that we have or the intelligence capabilities. So we have basically surrounded them with warships, and we have enough firepower to take them out easily within days, like I said. And their air defense systems are mostly rudimentary, and the older style, which is not a missile-based interceptor system. So it would be very difficult to intercept our longer-range missiles and things that could be fired from off the coast. So with that, I just want to say it is likely in the next couple of weeks, if things build up in terms of rhetoric, that we see some kind of military action or conflict involving Venezuela, but it would probably not be something that would involve like large-scale deployment of troops or boots on the ground necessarily, but it could just involve airstrikes and a lot of air superiority moves that would take out their critical military infrastructure and their ability to be a threat to America in the future, to house Russian missiles, and it could take out their potentially their land-based drug infrastructure as well, anything used for smuggling narcotics, obviously. And you could see this going out into the future. You could see the military start targeting, but I just couldn't see a conflict going on there for very long with the U.S. air supremacy established and U.S. superiority. Unless they're aided by foreign actors like Russia, they just lack the resources in Venezuela to resist such a force that'd be overwhelming. They just lack the resources to have a prolonged war against the United States. Their best hope would honestly be guerrilla style war.